I want to share a little video with you now about what we often don't hear about in history, but the amazing role that women, and particularly women of color, played in World War II.
Well, one lady told me when the war was, after the war was over, she said, Mary said, I have to work because I don't have a husband. They were really trying to get rid of us ladies after the war. They made the work hard for us, gave us more work. And she said, I have to work. I said, but you don't have to work, you have a husband. So I made up my mind. I said, well, if she can work. She was working on the left-hand side, and I was working on the right.
And what were you doing?
Putting the flow boats with motors, guns, these high-power guns. And I said, if she can do this work, I can too.
Mm-hmm.
And so I stuck there. Two ladies quit on the job that I was on. And I just held on to it.
That was Mrs. Mary Newsom, who worked at a Ford plant that had been retrofitted to produce cars with mounted guns during World War II. My maternal grandmother also worked during the war in a bomb manufacturing plant. That meant that every day she went to work knowing that she was one mishap away from not returning home. In that sense, she was as much a soldier as the airman who dropped those bombs on D-Day. She didn't do it because she wanted to, she did it because she had to, she needed to. To be sure, she also felt a sense of duty and took comfort in knowing that her risk was about securing the safety of the nation and the world. My grandmother, like millions of other persons around the country and around the world, adopted a wartime mentality. And of course, World War II was the war no one wanted to talk about, no one wanted to face, no one wanted to deal with because they were still recovering from the pain and horror of World War I. Winston Churchill had seen the war coming as Hitler, the duly elected fascist head of Germany, had turned that country into a war machine. For years, Churchill warned everyone within earshot about the rising Nazi threat, like Bill Gates warned us about pandemics, and for all their trouble, each man was either criticized or ignored. Great Britain and the world were not ready for war because her leaders failed to absorb the reality about which they had been warned. A similar collective state of denial is now occurring in real time in places around the world and here in America as we engage in World War III, the fight against COVID-19. Robert Hormet's article, World War III Isn't What the Strategists Thought It Would Be, provides a helpful frame for why we must understand this crisis as a world war. I will go further to submit that unless we shift our thinking to a World War III mentality, we will find ourselves again prolonging and exacerbating the pain of war and the loss of hundreds of thousands of more lives, the societal decline of quality of life for those who remain, and the mortal danger to the collective life of our republic. A World War III mentality requires us not simply to face, but to embrace the inconvenient truths about the situation that our species is currently facing. A few weeks ago, I shared with you about the prophet Jeremiah, who in the 32nd chapter of the book that bears his name, had been imprisoned by the head of state all because he had spoken a word that King Zedekiah did not want to hear. In chapter 37, King Zedekiah returns as if to say, now that you see what happens to people who speak inconvenient truths, now I want to know, is there a word from the Lord? Jeremiah's response is yes, it's the same word that I told you last time. You will be handed over to your enemy. Brothers and sisters, denial is not a plan. We must deal with the harsh reality of this moment, knowing that God will be present in our generation, just as he has in times past. It's easy to give God a war cry in the sanctuary and theoretically declare war when everything is easy, but when God disturbs your groove and you have to live with the societal uncertainty, the physical vulnerability, and the emotional fragility of this time, that's when the battle really begins. Ecclesiastes 3 begins by saying there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens. That section ends with these words, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Brothers and sisters, there will be a time for peace again, but this is not that time. This is a time for war. And a wartime mentality seeks to erase the lines between professional soldiers and citizens, the privileged classes and those who have been deprived of opportunity. Citizens in times of war often go about their daily business not because they don't fear death, but because they know they don't have a choice. The false notion that we can wait this virus out at home will not work economically. Other countries will not simply continue to finance our national debt so that our privileged class can telework while our blue-collar workers must starve at home or put themselves at risk if they're allowed to work. We all want to live, but is it moral to only require the financially vulnerable to be at risk? There is a nasty class element to this when we go back to work debate. My view is that not only is waiting this pandemic out not practical, but it also reeks of privilege for the millions of people who have been working steadily since the quarantine began, because like my grandmother, they have to. And the millions more who have been put out of work and would willingly take the risk if they still had a job. I want you to hear me. I'm not trying to rush you back to work, back to school, back to church, or back to brunch. I do want, however, to awaken you to the reality that at some point, we will need to learn to live in a new way by practicing every protocol possible. We're going to have to do, as the old song declared, watch, fight, and pray our way through this dangerous season and learn to sing the Lord's song in a strange land. And this is a strange land. Our national conversation has been framed as having to make a false choice between protecting lives and protecting the economy. Those who profit from turning people against one another through lies, race baiting, and gross incompetence are helping to fan the flame of partisanship. The president's daily deceptions, distractions, and willful attempts to divide our country accrete to more than merely a dereliction of his duty in the best interests of this country. His behavior is treasonous and should be punished to the fullest extent of the law because it undermines the public trust and pits us unnecessarily against one another. So rather than wrestling with difficult choices, we paint anyone who promotes prioritizing life and safety as being economically naive, irresponsible, and an enemy to the hourly wage worker who needs to work in order to live. Conversely, those who advocate reopening the economy are tagged as cruel capitalists, hungry to trade lives for money, protect big business at any cost, and as being more concerned about the unpayable national debt than mourning the death toll of our citizenry. The reason that this argument rages is because it is framed as a contradiction rather than a paradox. A contradiction involves two opposing ideas, whereas a paradox recognizes that contradicting ideas can point to a higher truth. In this instance, the paradoxical truth is that a failed economy is a healthcare issue. The data COVID-19 is currently generating demonstrate the health consequences that systemic racism creates and is evidenced by the grossly disproportionate mortality rates within the Black and brown community. The inability to afford medicine or shelter is a healthcare issue that must be treated with structural change to our economy. I agree with the CEO of JP Morgan, who says the coronavirus is an opportunity to build a more inclusive economy. That means that merely injecting liquidity into the existing economic system without restructuring it into a comprehensive wartime economy will lead to the 132 million Americans who before COVID-19 did not have $400 in savings that will cause them to be pushed into a permanent underclass. The opportunity to create a wartime economy that puts people back to work will have been missed. Yet, how do we go back to work without risking more lives? The answer is, of course, we can't. A wartime mentality enlists the assistance of the entire country to comply with stay-at-home orders, social distancing, the wearing of face masks to protect not just ourselves, but one another. That means that postal and transit workers, first responders, preachers, scientists, accountants, developers, attorneys, and food service providers, all of us must see ourselves as essential workers and frontline soldiers. We will not win this war by trying to save sectors and sections of our citizenry. To quote Dr. King, we must live together as brothers and sisters or perish together as fools. My brothers and sisters, what is needed now, as always, is real moral leadership. Moral leadership introduces new language like service, sacrifice, suffering, and salvation. Moral leadership helps executives to consider the impact of lives rather than simply shareholder value. Moral leadership compels competing political parties to call a truce and collaborate in a way that will restructure our society and economy. Moral leadership requires us as citizens to be helpful to our neighbors and communities in ways that we have not seen in generations. Moral leadership is not fanciful. It is the only way forward against the cold and cruel invisible enemy that endangers every member of our society. It is the time-tested response by societies whenever faced with national or global threats. Moral leadership by itself is not an institution. It is most commonly found in faith, and uniquely in faith in Christ, who is the exemplar of servant leadership and champion of the beloved community. I am not aware of a more vibrant symbol of sacrifice than the cross, and a clearer invitation to earthly and eternal salvation than in Jesus. My brothers and sisters, it is time for war, and we are glad to know that God is on our side. My name is Matthew Watley, and I endorse this message.